Hi, I'm Chris Williams for AAM Insight. Today on the program, I'm joined by Charlie Kupchan. He's a professor of international relations at Georgetown University, and he's the author of a new book, How Enemies Become Friends, The Sources of Stable Peace. Charles, I'd like to begin with a question about the impetus of this book, because a lot of people have written about the causes of war, not as many about the causes of peace. Why did you want to explore this topic?
Well, partly because, as you just said, not many people have written about it. And I came to the project by observing that during the first Bush administration, the United States and Europe were beginning to drift apart, fundamental differences of view about the war in Iraq. And I sort of said to myself, is it possible that Europe and the United States could again become rivals? Is it possible that war could sneak back in as a tool of statecraft? And that led me to ask the question, well, how did this community become a non-war community to begin with? And then the other, I think, intellectual opening was looking around at the world, seeing that peace breaks out, but realizing that very few people pay attention. And that's partly because when wars happen, they make noise. People die. Reporters flock to the scene. Right now, on the U.S.-Canadian border, there are no reporters, there are no troops, there's nothing happening, and therefore no one pays attention. But it's the non-event that is in some ways what's revolutionary, both in intellectual terms and in real-world terms. And so I went out and asked, why are there no troops on the U.S.-Canadian border? Why are there no troops on the Franco-German border? Why are there no troops on the border between England and Scotland? These used to be sites of killing. Now, nobody even thinks about the possibility of armed conflict. How did that happen?
Sure. And there are some rationales floating around out there. Economic integration is one we hear a lot about. Peace theory is another. Were those explanations useful to you? And if not, which causal mechanisms did you find more useful?
I went into the project thinking that both of those mechanisms, commercial interdependence and democratic affinity or democratic peace, would be important variables, and they weren't. In some of the cases that I look at, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, Argentina, the Concert of Europe, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the United Arab Emirates, the parties involved are anything but democratic. Many of them are absolute autocracies, but they're reliable peacemakers. And so that led me to question this assumption that pervades American academia and American policymaking: democracy's good, autocracy's bad. On the commercial front, we are led to believe that when you get traders and investors to come in, peace breaks out. And in all of the cases I looked at, bar one, the one exception being German integration in the 19th century, economic integration matters only once the politics are right.
Or, like you pointed out, sometimes economic integration is facilitated for political rationales or reasons.
Yes, but it's the politics stupid. It's the diplomacy stupid. And that, I think, provides us to be cautious about the idea that if China invests in Japan or Japan in China, they will become friends. That if we give money to Israelis and Palestinians to have joint ventures, peace will break out. Maybe we should give money to Israelis and Palestinians, but it won't matter unless they sit down at the table and resolve Jerusalem, the borders, the right of return, and all the fundamental political issues on the table.
The most in-depth case study you did was the AngloAmerican case study, and that was interesting for a lot of reasons. One, because we think about it today as the special relationship, and they're so close, but it was not much more than a century ago that they were very far apart. Can you take us down just briefly the road between foe and friend and how we got to such a special relationship?
Sure. The story starts in the 1700s when the United States isn't yet the United States. It's the colonies, and they break away from Great Britain. They fight another war in 1812, and the British are kind enough to burn down the White House. And then for the rest of the 19th century, we kind of glare at each other and wonder if war will break out again. And then everything starts to change around 1895 and 1896. And the source of change is a British perception that they are no longer able to sustain the full range of imperial commitments in the face of the rise of the United States, Japan, and Germany. And so they look around at the world and they say the only way we can deal with this problem is to move one of our enemies into the friend column. They choose the United States, and the precipitating event is a dispute over the border between British Guiana and Venezuela. And the United States, which is feeling uppity at this time, says, we have a say in this. This is in our backyard. And Lord Salisbury replies to President Cleveland, buzz off, stay out of it. Then there's talk of war. And once war enters the picture, the British back down. They make an offering of peace to the United States, and that's the end of the first sort of opening move. The second move, which runs for about 2 years, is the U.S. and the Brits exchanging concessions on borders, on fishing rights, on the Panama Canal, probing one another. And this is when the two parties really begin to feel that they can do business with each other. They don't mean harm, no ill will. That gets us into the more sociological parts of the story. After the rivalry has damped down, then the two societies start to integrate. The Anglo-American Chamber of Commerce, the Anglo-American Committee are born. They begin to lobby actively for rapprochement. And then the final stage of the process is the generation of a new narrative in which the other becomes in part the self. And Teddy Roosevelt and his counterpart in Britain start talking about war between the US and the UK as civil war, as fratricide, as war between brothers. And that really consolidates the process. And if you look at the documents, you will see that by 1902, 03, 04, when that dialogue, when that discourse changes, the British Admiralty and War Office are tearing up their war plans against the United States, and the U.S. is beginning to say, we don't even need to contemplate about war with Britain.
That's very interesting. And one of the things that seemed like it cropped up again and again in the case studies, and I think you summarized it very succinctly and very well, was that oftentimes the politics of rapprochement, of coming together, are more difficult than the actual policies of coming together. And I think that has a lot of resonance for today. Maybe use the case of Iran, where it is so loaded, to kind of tease out that logic a little bit more for us.
If there is a blockage that keeps appearing, it's domestic politics. And that's because when a leader reaches out to an adversary and says, I want to make peace with you, the nationalists come at home, sharpen the knives and come out and say, you are a traitor, you're a coward, why are you making peace with the enemy? And oftentimes they prevail. And some of the cases that I look at, they start down the road to friendship and they don't make it. And it's usually because there are domestic opponents who stand up and stop it from continuing. So let's take the case of Iran today. The United States has made the opening gesture. The ball is now in Tehran's court. We don't know whether Tehran is going to respond in kind and agree to some kind of deal to export the uranium or shut down their enrichment process. Let's say they do. Then it comes back to the United States to take the next step, and that's when it gets complicated on the home front, because Obama can't do it alone. He can do the diplomacy, but he actually needs the support of Congress and the Senate to do things like drop sanctions, reduce sanctions. Congress has been very involved in imposing sanctions against Iran.
Interesting. And one of the things that I'm trying to understand is, how do you give an offering that's significant enough to make the other side take notice, but not so significant as to derail your own domestic politics?
At the beginning, you need to do something that's bold enough so that the other party sits up and says, this is interesting. You got to rap your knuckles on the window so they pay attention. It can't be so bold that you expose yourself and invite domestic opposition, so you got to find that right balance. If the reciprocity is forthcoming, then you make another peace offering, perhaps a little bolder. In the Anglo-American case, it starts with borders in South America. Then it moves up to fishing rights along the coast of the United States and Canada. Then they tackle the tough issues, the border between Alaska and Canada, the Panama Canal, American expansion into the Pacific, kicking the Spanish out of Cuba. Those are the core issues that were possible only because they had first dealt with minor issues and built enough trust. So it really is a diplomatic dance that builds over time.
Thanks so much, Charles.
My pleasure.